Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Looking for the right holiday outfits without breaking the bank? JCPenney is a one-stop shop for the whole family. Whether you're dressing up or dressing down, JCPenney has a great range of apparel for men, women, and kids. So you can spend less time doing this and more time doing this. Make your holidays count. JCPenney. Shop in store or jcp.com.
Introducing Wondersuite from Bluehost.com. Website creation is hard. Was hard, but not anymore, thanks to Wondersuite from Bluehost. Answer a few questions about your business and goals, and the Wondersuite tools will automatically create your website or store. From there, you can customize your design, colors, and content, and we automatically help you get found in search engines like Google and Bing. From step-by-step guidance to suggested plugins, Bluehost makes WordPress wonderful for everyone. Go to bluehost.com/Wondersuite.
Check out the next generation of smart glasses by Ray-Ban and Meta. Listen to music without muting the world around you with open-ear speakers, or capture the world from your unique perspective with a built-in 12-megapixel camera. Now, you can live stream the moment straight from your glasses and even take calls hands-free without interrupting your flow. The latest tech combined with iconic style. The next generation of smart glasses by Ray-Ban and Meta.
Alarm, alarm. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Murray and James Holland, your Second World War podcast of choice. And Jim, very fortunate to be speaking to an excellent guest, aren't we?
Yeah.
Who we've spoken to before, in fact.
Yes, we have. A great friend of the show, a great personal mate of mine, an aviation nut, the author of many best-selling books is, of course, Rowland White. Rowland, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's fantastic to be here sort of under genuine pretenses, really. Last time round, we were talking about the Falklands War, so finally I get to talk about the Second World War.
Well, I know you. I mean, Al, it's really good news, actually, because Rowland's become afflicted. Yeah, and he's fully realised the errors of his ways, and that, you know, remote British Army and SAS operations in Saudi Arabia and Oman are no longer what you need. What you really need is just Second World War books.
I'm swimming in a much deeper ocean now.
Well, the last we saw of you was at We Have Ways Fest, where you were paired up with Joe Coles to talk about the Western Whirlwind.
Yeah, that was having spent 2 years talking about the Mosquito. To end up spending an hour talking about the Whirlwind was a bit of a surprise.
Well, my favourite moment still was the picture of Sid Vicious that he came up with. And I was thinking, where's this heading? And then it was promised too much too soon.
I mean, with Joe, you really never know. But it was fair warning to some of those who are sort of underage in the tent that there was worse to come.
That's absolutely true.
So, Rowland, as you know, I absolutely loved your book, Mosquito. And the great thing about it is, I suppose it is about the mosquito, but it's so much more than that. And I can tell that you did what I often do, which is you get into a subject, they get very, very excited about the course of your research, and end up doing lots and lots of rabbit holes. And doing rabbit holes and going down little sort of side streets is exactly what we do on this podcast. So obviously, very in favour of it. It is about the mosquito, and I think you should just, we have talked about the mosquito before on the podcast, but for those who haven't listened to that episode, maybe just a very, very, very quick kind of 2-minute recap on the birth of the mosquito and why it's so amazing and cool and why we all love it. And then we can talk about, it's as much about the Danish resistance as it is about mosquito operations, let's face it. And all those cool people like Basil Embry and things. We should talk about him. He's brilliant.
Definitely. There's no shortage of great people. As you know, like you, I've never seen a rabbit hole I've been able to avoid jumping down. And in fact, being relatively recently afflicted, I think, has been probably to the book's great benefit in that I've sort of come to everything with a sort of fresh pair of eyes and genuine sort of curiosity and wonder about everything I've discovered. It's all felt kind of exciting and new. Not least the Mosquito. I mean, its story is relatively familiar, I suppose, to people. As you know, as people will know, you had Des Curtis and John Lilly on, last year, sort of talking about it. Des, a former Mosquito navigator, but it was an aeroplane that sort of struggled to find its place initially, and it was only through a couple of a very high-profile supporters that it managed to sort of somehow thread its way through to production. The RAF was, as you know, completely committed to the idea of strategic bombing as a sort of raison d'etre. And it was realised in the late 30s that it was going to also have to defend itself against the possibility of German bombers. And so there was fighter production was ramped up massively. Where the Mosquito was going to fit into that was uncertain. But Geoffrey de Havilland, inspired by the success of the DH-9 in the First World War, believed that there was room for an unarmed bomber, the survival of which depended on its flight performance, its speed and the height at which it could fly, which is very much the model of the DH-9. Having sort of dismissed the idea of license building aeroplanes for other companies, decided to privately fund a prototype of the Mosquito in order to give, well, actually, it was less to do with strategic materials, more to do with speed of production. By building it out of wood, which was something that de Havilland had great experience of doing, and had built this extraordinary wooden airliner, the Albatross, in the mid-30s, reckoned that they could get it into production using materials that were not in such high demand, i.e. aluminium, give it a chance of proving its worth. That's exactly what they did, and it was immediately obvious in 1940 that they'd built a machine with absolutely remarkable performance, which was supported throughout 1940 by Wilfred Freeman, who was in charge of RAF aircraft acquisition, and who was said to keep a Tommy gun in his office just to keep Beaverbrook away and away from cancelling the thing. So, I mean, the Bomber Command didn't want it. The Royal Navy actually wanted it as a target tug, but there was a relatively obscure requirement for a high-altitude reconnaissance aeroplane. And that was what Freeman held on to. And he got a production order for the Mosquito as a reconnaissance plane before it was then subsequently ordered as a fighter and a bomber. But, immediately it flew. It impressed everyone with what it was capable of doing.
Did he have to pull strings to get his hands on Merlin engines at this point? Because they're being parcelled out quite meanly, aren't they? They've been allocated, haven't they? So does he have to call in favours for that?
The Mosquito was, from the outset, designed around the Merlin engine to the same extent as the Lancaster, the Spitfire, the Hurricane. I mean, as you know, the Hurricane was delayed because the Merlin was delayed. But I mean, essentially, the Mosquito was the smallest amount of airframe you could squeeze around a crew of two, a 2,000-pound bomb load, and two Merlin engines, and it simply wouldn't have worked. I mean, we were talking about the Whirlwind, obviously, and how crucial those Peregrine engines were. It wouldn't have worked with any other aeroplane. The margins and the compromises involved in building any airframe are so fine, so slender, that choose something else and you end up with a Barracuda.
Well, cue the early Mustangs, for example.
Yeah, well, that was a really good example. As we discovered, James, when we were sort of looking into Mustangs and Merlins and Allisons, the Merlin was very, very fortunately a very similar size to the Allison engine that originally powered the Mustang, and fitted into that engine bay fortuitously comfortably. Came with that great benefits, the sort of high altitude performance of the Mustang. Sure.
But we should talk about, so that's the Mosquito, but really the book sort of really kicks off and gets going in 1943, doesn't it? Although the focus point of the book is the raid on the Gestapo headquarters at the Shellhus in Copenhagen on 21st of March 1945. There's quite a long run into that big moment, and I mean we'll absolutely get onto that in a minute, because it's just amazing, and the episode in the book is just, it's so brilliantly done. It really is just seat of your pants stuff. But it goes back to 1943, and really up until that, Denmark's had quite a quiet war, hasn't it? It's a bit of a backwater. They're allowed to sort of govern themselves in pretty much their own way. But then there's a kind of change of personnel, change of fortunes for the Germans in the Second World War, and everything starts to get a bit more heavy-handed. And as it gets more heavy-handed and there's a sort of light at the end of the tunnel of the war, so the Danish resistance starts to really pick up as well.
That's right. I mean, the critical month with respect to the story I'm telling, but also for Denmark and in a way the Mosquito Force as well, was January 1943. So January 1943, three things happened. A new chief organiser was parachuted into Denmark by Special Operations Executive, a remarkable man called Flemming Moos.
Yeah, he's amazing, isn't he? He's constantly being done for embezzling and stealing stuff. Really funny. And being banned to Liberia.
I sort of feel like he was probably less of a fraudster than just really enthusiastic and very careless with numbers.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because even after the war, he gets done after the war, doesn't he? But he gets let off.
He gets let off. I mean, I think he was always... I mean, the reason he had to make his way to war in a dugout canoe is he'd already been exiled to West Africa for forging company checks at Denmark. So if you were looking for a spy, he's perfect. So, but I mean, except that he can barely see. He wears sort of Coke bottom glasses, and without them, he's almost blind. But they parachuted him in after performing plastic surgery on him, which sort of transformed his appearance. And the cover story for that was that he was going to be in a movie. And they actually got Vera Lynn to go and visit him in the hospital to sort of underline the cover story. But he was parachuted in January 1943 and lent a huge new energy to the Danish resistance. But
he is the SOE's man in Denmark. So he is, although he's Danish, he's going back into Denmark, having been kind of banned to Liberia and had plastic surgery. I mean, he is much more of a, despite the Coke bottom glasses, he's much more of a James Bond figure in so much that he goes around sort of, causing mayhem everywhere, but in a really positive way.
Oh no, I mean, he's fantastic. He's really larger than life character. Fantastically sort of debonair as well. He smoked very expensive cigarettes. He was always sort of tweaking his uniform to make it look more elegant. He claimed he was a major when he was a captain, and he just sort of did whatever was required at any given moment in time in order to sort of achieve success. He did so with relish, and as I say, transformed the fortunes of SOE in Denmark, and was there in situ. Living undercover as he had a cover story, a cover alias, living in a different location every night for about nearly 2 years before eventually the Gestapo net around him closed so tight that he had to escape with his wife.
And he had scores of cover names, didn't he?
He had lots of different code names as well.
Tabletop and things like that.
And I don't think he was Turnip. I think he might have been Gin. I mean, it sort of changed every 3 months. I took the decision in the book to sort of stick to one just because it became so confusing. But yes, his code name kept on changing. Those glasses aside, he was completely James Bondish and seemingly sort of fearless as well. But he was exactly what at the time the Danish resistance needed, and what he did was harness the different elements of the resistance in Denmark. There was the civil resistance made up of kind of disparate groups, one of which was the communists, who were sort of better organised prior to the Second World War than the other groups, but also the military intelligence, who sort of resented the civilian resistance movement. But it was Flemming Moos and SOE's job to sort of harness them all together for a common cause. And uniquely, Denmark was dependent on SOE for intelligence, which came from the Danish military intelligence organisation, and not SIS, who operated throughout the rest of occupied Europe. Quirk of fate, Denmark belonged exclusively to SOE, despite SIS sort of chipping away at it throughout the Second World War.
How fascinating. So the SOE are left to their own devices in Denmark, essentially.
And broadly speaking, it's pretty successful.
It did work. I mean, they sort of argued about the most extraordinary things, like who was going to get which sort of passwords, code words. They decided that SOE would get vegetables while SIS would have meat and fish. And I mean, and these are the things that they would sort of lock horns over. But they tried to poach Flemming Moos when he came back to London in the belly of Mosquito, of course, which we can get onto. But he came back to London for a briefing, and at that point, SIS took him out for dinner at the Savoy and tried to get him drunk and sort of get him to reveal all his secrets.
And
Amazing.
Rowland, he hooks up with Inky Witchfeld, doesn't he? And Inky Witchfeld's mother is this absolute heroine of the whole story. She's a sort of posh aristo, isn't she?
From a storytelling point of view, and to any subject that I sort of come to, I'm sort of looking for my stars and supporting actors and extras, so that fashion the material into something that sort of feels like a thriller. And in Monica Witchfeld, her daughter Inky, and Monica's best friend Suzanne Lassen, and a meeting they had in summer of 1939 in Denmark. I was gifted this small group of people who then thread their way through the book. So, as you mentioned, Monica was a hero of the Danish resistance. She was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who married a Danish landowner. And moved to Denmark, and she had 3 children. Her daughter Inky followed her into the resistance, and they kept that secret from the sons and her husband, as Inky said. As Inky said much later, "Oh no, we didn't tell father. You couldn't trust him with a thing," and so they sort of operated independently of the rest of the family. But Monica went on to become the first woman sentenced to death by the kangaroo courts the Nazis set up in Denmark. That was later commuted, and she was sentenced prisoner of war to Germany. Her daughter Inky became very enamoured with resistance life and married Fleming Moose.
And she goes back to London, doesn't she, and trains?
Yeah. Eventually she goes back for parachute training herself. But Inky and Fleming Moose operate as a sort of Bonnie and Clyde couple in wartime Copenhagen. I mean, they're having the time of their lives. And the other family, Suzanne Lassen's family, are equally remarkable. And they as I say, meet in summer 1939. Suzanne's oldest son, Anders, went on to become the only member of the wartime SAS to win the VC. And his brother, Franz, followed him into the British military after escaping Denmark. First of all, joined the SOE's small-scale raiding force until that was wrapped up, then transferred to become an agent and parachuted into Denmark. And his arrest and torture was the sort of first card that fell that leads to that raid on the shell house. But then there's also their cousin, Axel. So the Lassens were a Danish-German family. And their cousin Axel van den Busch was in an elite Prussian Guards regiment, and he was asked in Ukraine by the SS, or ordered by Ukraine in the SAS in Ukraine by the SS to establish a cordon around where the SS were massacring Jews and throwing them into a pit, and he was so disgusted by what he saw that he realised he could no longer serve the regime to which he'd previously been loyal through his regiment, and he knew he had to either die in battle, desert, or actively try to bring down the Third Reich, and he chose the latter. Made his way to Klaus von Stauffenberg, who said, "You're the guy we're going to use for our first attempt on Hitler's life." And the plan was that von den Busch, who was very tall, blonde, and sort of typically Aryan looking, was going to model these new Eastern Front uniforms for Hitler at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. And the plan was all in place. Von den Busch was there in East Prussia, ready to model these uniforms, wearing a suicide vest, during which he was going to hug Hitler. God. Set them both off and blow the two of them up. And the plans that had been laid for the coup that was going to follow Hitler's death were all buried and in place, ready to go. And then 2 days before the operation, Mosquitoes, in the days just before the Battle of Berlin, bombed Berlin as a sort of nuisance raid. They didn't care what they were bombing. They were just trying to keep Berlin off guard, off balance. And by chance, they struck a boxcar in a marshalling yard in Berlin, which contained all these prototype uniforms. So the uniforms that von den Busch was going to wear were destroyed by Mosquitoes 2 days before this attempted assassination. So, I mean, as much as the Mosquito helped us win the war, it also inadvertently may have delayed its end by a couple of years.
Oh, God!
It's absolutely the most amazing story, isn't it?
That's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. I also like the story of, I think it was Moose, wasn't it? He goes to Paul Bork Anderson and says, or is it Paul Bork Anderson who goes to, who's that, when they blow up the Linz and they go visit that guy working, there's a guy working on the Linz, which is a German ship, and they just say, right, you've got to blow it up.
Yeah, that's Paul Borch Anderson, who, another Dane who... The Danish resistance was largely made up of merchant seamen, because when the Germans invaded Denmark, they had no interest in Denmark. They just wanted to get to Norway, and it was a convenient stepping stone. The radio call went out to all Danish merchant seamen that they could come to the UK. It was going to offer them safe harbour. They didn't have to return home. And so initially, unlike the Norwegians, the Belgians, Dutch, French, etc., Czechs, Poles, there was no pool of men and women from which the Allies could draw forces. They couldn't form Danish regiments or Danish fighter squadrons. And that was further complicated by the fact that technically, legally speaking, Denmark was an Axis power. I mean, it was sort of under the aegis of German control, and it still had a king and a government, democratically elected government in place. And so it was only through sort of quirk of fate, which was that the King Christian of Denmark happened to be commander-in-chief of the Buffs regiment, that they could, through that loophole, employ Danish merchant seamen as resistance fighters, reporting directly to their commander-in-chief, who was also the legal head of government in Denmark. And so that's why there were no Danish regiments, but somehow we found a way of getting the Danes into the Allied armed forces. Borch Anderson was parachuted back into Denmark. He was a member of the Danish army. He was a Danish army officer. He found a young electrician who was working on the Linz, which was a ship which was being it was a sort of merchant ship being converted into a mine layer for the Kriegsmarine, and named the Linz, obviously, which was the town in which Hitler grew up. So had a sort of special significance for that. And laid limpet mines, which were dropped into Jutland from the special duties RAF squadrons that were dropping supplies into Denmark, and blew it up. And that led to strikes and riots, because the German clampdown led to the oppression of the dockyard workers. They went on strike. The Germans reacted to that, as you can imagine, badly, led to further strikes, nationwide strikes, and all of that was what triggered the final breakdown of the relationship, or the resignation of the Danish government. That was really the point at which, in August 1943, the resistance movement, as a sort of widespread, effective military operation that really disrupted German plans, accelerated and ultimately secured Denmark's post-war reputation.
Because the Germans say to the democratic government, you have to endorse these very strict rules that we're now imposing. And they just said no, basically, didn't they?
It is striking, though, isn't it, Rowland, that the Germans have been not soft on Denmark after this point, but essentially kind of laissez-faire with it. They've let the Danes get on with it. Why is that, really? But they've sort of left Denmark intact, and it's not like what they've done in France, where they've installed occupied half the country and installed a puppet government in the other. What's going on? Why are they letting the Danes continue essentially with the status quo up to this point?
I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's one which has on occasions prompted strong feelings. There was a feeling certainly within the UK that. Denmark was simply not pulling its weight, that it had caved in too easily to the German. I mean, the decision was taken to surrender within hours of the Germans rolling into Denmark. But on the basis that any kind of resistance was simply going to lead to unnecessary slaughter. And in terms of protecting the Danish population, it was undoubtedly, the right decision. But it meant that there was this sort of weird situation in which Denmark existed with a real minimum the Danish are, and it have some interesting national characteristics. And I think that it's justified, fantastically sort of obstinate and stubborn, and they sort of proved this later in the war. But they're also very much they uphold the rule of law. They elect their leaders, then place their trust in them. It's not a country, unlike the UK, inclined to ignore stop signs on pedestrian crossings. People stop until it turns green, and then they cross, because everyone sort of adopts that sort of collective responsibility. And so when the government said, this is the decision we've made, and we're your elected government, the country by and large went with it. And amazingly, the Germans let the Danish army, the Danish Air Force and Navy, remain in place. There were a few things which were appropriated by the Germans, but by and large, they remained at their barracks in their uniforms, ready to defend Denmark ostensibly. The mistake the Germans made with respect to that was they left the military intelligence organisation intact, and that was from day one. When British diplomats were sent out of Denmark on a sealed train, before that train left the country, Danish military intelligence threw some rolled up newspapers through a window, and contained within them were all the dispositions of the German military in Denmark. So from day one, Danish military intelligence were providing SOE and SIS with absolutely vital information on what the Germans were up to.
How incredible!
Yeah, it is absolutely amazing. Listen, we should talk about. We should flip back to mosquitoes and Basil Embry and Two Group.
Let's
should we take a break and then do that, and then we've got to get to the denouement, which is just amazing.
Okay, well, we'll see you in a tick.
Looking for the right holiday outfits without breaking the bank? JCPenney is a one-stop shop for the whole family. Whether you're dressing up or dressing down, JCPenney has a great range of apparel for men, women, and kids. So you can spend less time doing this and more time doing this. Make your holidays count. JCPenney. Shop in store or jcp.com.
This episode is brought to you by Pluralsight. Your org needs teams skilled in tomorrow's tech today. Whether you want faster innovation, better customer experiences, or streamlined software delivery, those solutions require teams skilled and savvy in the latest technologies. Equip your people with the skills they need to make the most of today's tools and tech. Visit pluralsight.com/pod and try it for free.
Here's something you've never heard before.
Stop. This is Simply Safe.
Introducing 24/7 Lifeguard Protection, only from Simply Safe Home Security. Now, monitoring agents can see and speak to intruders through our new indoor camera to help stop crime in real time and for fast police response. Get 20% off any new system with Fast Protect monitoring at simplysafe.com/Spotify. Advanced home security, 24/7 professional monitoring for less than $1 a day. There's no safe like Simply Safe.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, where we've managed to rabbit hole ourselves quite comprehensively into a full warren of Danish rabbits. And what we need to do now is drag ourselves back to the thing we're here to talk about.
Get to the surface of the side of the hill, leave the warren behind, and get to the meat of it, which is, I'm a bit obsessed with Basil Embry. For those who don't know, he's an incredibly cool gung-ho RAF commander. Who rises up through the ranks very, very quickly because he's just so obviously brilliant at what he does. He's fearless. He leads from the front. He's charismatic. He's clever, and he has this amazing ability to kind of see things and see what the issues are and sort them out. And the first example of this is. We'll go back to his incredible escape he has in 1940. But later on, he's recovered from the. You tell that story first, and then I'll tell you about Malta.
Yeah, I mean, Basil Embry's genuine extraordinary character, and he also has these sort of piercing blue eyes that people always sort of reckon sort of just looked through you. And I mean, in a movie, he'd be played by Colin Farrell or somewhere. He just has it all. He's sort of made of charisma. He was shot down early in the Battle of France and Blenheim, and then spent 6 weeks on the run. I was captured a couple of times on both occasions, escaped, on one time killing his German guards and hiding in a heap of manure for hours and hours before eventually he, it's a story. It is genuinely a book all in its own right. And he got over the border into Spain in the end and immediately went back to rejoin his squadron in Suffolk. But he went on to run night fighters from Wittering and eventually took command of Two Group in 2TAF, 2nd Tactical Air Force. So he was responsible for all of the medium bomber forces within 2nd Tactical Air Force. And he sort of attracted quality personnel towards him. He wanted people who saw the war in the same way as he did, who would relentlessly attack the enemy, who were driven and who would always put themselves in harm's way. And so he attracted people like Bob Braham, who was competing with Johnny Johnson to be the UK or Britain's leading ace. Laddie Lucas forced his way, took a demotion to force his way into 2 Group. And so he built this organisation which was very much in his own image. And he left, in terms of preparation things, he left no stone unturned. He was remarkable.
Well, I came across him first when I was doing my Malta book all those years ago, because as I may have mentioned a few times on this podcast, I'm not a huge fan of Hugh P. Lloyd, who was the air officer commanding of Malta for that kind of crucial middle period. And Tedder, who was the air officer commanding in the Middle East, of the RAF in the Middle East, got Embry to come out on a mission, a sort of fact-finding mission to the Middle East, and just sort of, you're a fighter leader, you're a gung-ho guy, what's your take on this, a fresh set of eyes? And he got over to the Middle East and was doing, great works in Egypt. And then Tedder said to him, look, there's obviously trouble at the camp at Malta. Can you go over to Malta and just sort of say what you think? And so he went over there. He was over there literally for 3 days or a week or something. And he said, right, what you need is lots of Spitfires, and you need a ground controller, and you need this and you need that, and then it'll all be fine. And basically it all came to pass. And the amazing thing is that he could see that in literally 24 hours of being there in a way that all the other people, that are commanders that have been, including Hugh P. Lloyd, who'd been on Malta, couldn't. And then he comes back, and as you say, when he takes over 2 Group is the kind of forgotten group. It's the kind of the dud of Bomber Command, isn't it? It's not really sort of going anywhere, and it's kind of sort of got morale issues and all the rest of it. And he takes over, he just totally grips it. And it's one of those things. He's a bit like kind of Mary Cunningham, where his sheer kind of charisma and personality absolutely just sort of sprinkle down from the top and sort of cast this incredible kind of sort of fairy dust over everyone below and just sort of transform it. And he turns around 2nd Group. And the great thing about 2nd Group is the 2nd Group gets moved from Bomber Command into the 2nd Tactical Air Force, which is an absolute result for it, because Embry can't do what he wants to do under Harris, but he can in 2nd TAF, which is obviously commanded by Mary Cunningham.
Embry actually served under Bomber Harris in Iraq. So Harris was Embry's squadron commander when they were kind of on policing duties there. But no, you're absolutely right. And there was, Harris had to decide whether or not he wanted Don Bennett or Embry to run the Pathfinders. And Embry was certainly in contention for that. But in the end, and I think the way I put it in the book was that with 2 Group, he got a role that was much better suited to his particular talents, in that it was a job which meant he could really see the whites of the eyes of the enemy. And, that's what he wanted. And 2 Group, it was like a sort of Cinderella. Nobody really wanted it. Harris certainly didn't want it. Although when he handed it over, and this is a sort of interesting point about the way Embry sort of grappled with his new command. When Harris gave 2 Group to 2nd Tactical Air Force, he kept the 2 Mosquito squadrons around which he built the Pathfinder units. And so when Embry was given 2 Group, he had this kind of motley collection of medium bombers, Bostons and Mitchells, and was threatened with a load of Vultee Vengeance dive bombers from the States, which he went and tested at Boscombe Down, just said, this is going to kill more people than the Fairy Battles did. There's absolutely no way I'm having these. And Lee Mallory allowed him to make his case personally to the Air Ministry. He said, what I need are Mosquitoes. And while he kept the Bostons and Mitchells, he was allowed to build 2 wings of Mosquitoes, 138, 140, and he was first exposed to the Mosquito and loved it when he was running the night fighter squadrons. But so the book is sort of built around the exploits of 140 wing, which was made up of 464 Royal Australian Air Force, 21 Squadron RAF, and 487 Royal New Zealand Air Force. But it was transformative, and in working out how best to use those Mosquitoes, he left no stone unturned. And he was far too senior at this point. He was an Air Vice Marshal to be flying on operations. But, he took all the name tags out of his uniforms, took all the unnecessary rings off the sleeves, and had a pair of dog tags in the name of Wing Commander Smith, and flew on mission after mission after mission, and expected all his senior officers to do the same. But on the very first low-level mission, he joined to France. On the way home, he hit a migrating duck, and it really badly smashed up the Mosquito. And so his reaction to that was, okay, this is clearly something that could jeopardise the success of our operations. What do we do? So he got in touch with...
ducks?
Ducks, yeah, exactly.
Low-flying birds.
So he thought, right, what we need to know about is just the migrating patterns of ducks around the Frisian Islands. And so he got in touch with Peter Scott, the son of polar explorer Robert Falcon Scott, to study the migration patterns of ducks around the Frisian Islands, so that he could make sure that they were they gave themselves the very best chance of avoiding them. When he wanted models of targets, and the Air Ministry said, "Oh yeah, we'll get that to you in 6 weeks," he said, "I don't want it 6 weeks. I want it next week." And so he put together Mungwell Park, two groups headquarters, his own model making unit made up of, he had cake decorators on that particular, they worked in the attic as cake decorators, making models of targets, including Copenhagen as well. I mean, he would always simply sidestep the Air Ministry or senior command whenever he was given the opportunity. And the only one occasion when he couldn't was the attack on Amiens prison to free the French resistance, where he was specifically ordered by Lee Mallory not to join that mission, speculation being that he simply knew too much about D-Day plans. And he said to his remarkable 21-year-old navigator, Ted Sismore, who still wanted to go, well, if I can't go, you can't go. And Lee Mallory organised a special meeting at TUTAF headquarters to make sure that Embry couldn't tell him he hadn't gone, but go anyway.
It's absolutely, honestly, Embry is literally one of the... He's one of the great characters. He's such a lad.
So many of these people you've been talking about so far, Rowland, do you think, what on earth would they have all done without a war? Because they're so suited. They're so suited to this set of circumstances.
Fleming Moose.
All of them. They're people who need a life of adventure, and the war sort of plops it in their lap. And I mean, obviously, it's fantastic. There are people who are good at this sort of thing. But you do wonder, they'd have had to be climbing Everest or something, wouldn't they?
Yeah. And so jumping off the side of Mont Blanc with a parachute on the back.
Many of them sort of subsequently did. I mean, he's a sort of peripheral character in the book, but I just think he's absolutely fantastic guy, a fighter pilot called Jazz Storer, who was an ace by 19 during the Battle of Britain. He was a sort of big lad, and He had all of the sort of linings of his RAF uniforms sort of specially tailored in red silk. And he went to North Africa, where he and his great mate sort of liberated an Italian village because it just looked pretty from the air. Then they realised that this village was being attacked by bandits every night. So they sort of jacked up their Hurricanes on the main street and just sort of waited in the cockpits with all the electrics turned on for the bandits to arrive, and then they just fired at them. And so they protected these Italians who were living in fear of their lives from these bandit raids with a little sort of improvisation, entirely kind of unauthorized. He was also, Jazz, the first Allied pilot to fly into occupied France after D-Day. He flew into Paris as part of the air delivery letter service before the liberation, only discovered that he'd landed quite near a Gestapo headquarters and somehow sort of spirited away by the French resistance and stayed in Paris until the liberation of Paris. But he got bored of being in the air delivery service and wanted to return to the front line, so ends up flying Mustangs. And he commanded 64 126, and I think there was 264 was the other. He moved around the Mustang squadrons. There were a handful of bosses, as Michel Donnet, Arne Austin, the Norwegian, and they sort of seemed to share them all. But after the war, just to speak to your point about them needing a war to sort of keep them entertained, he became a vet in Cheshire, but realised he needed to keep flying, so he joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve. He flew his Meteor underneath the Menai Straits Bridge. He also went powerboating in the British Offshore Championships, and he drove a V12 at Jaguar XJS with personalised Jazz Storer plates. And also managed to commandeer his own Yak 9 in Italy at the end of the war, which of course he sort of scribbled Jazz on the side of. I mean, they're people whose stories you just can't make up. And he's just a sort of bit part player in the Mosquito book. I mean, there's a list of 20. And as I say, it becomes difficult to decide on your stars, your extras, your supporting characters. But I mean, Embry certainly is a star. Ted Sizemore, the navigator I mentioned, is just a remarkable character, because there's a sort of circling back a bit to January 1943, which was what got us off down into Denmark. But in the Mosquito story, January 1943 was critical in that it was the month in which Ted Sizemore led a raid to Berlin specifically to disrupt the 10th anniversary Nazis' accession to power, their celebrations in Berlin. And he dropped bombs on Berlin on the dot of 11 o'clock, just as Hermann Goering got up to speak. And Goering had to be sort of whipped off stage, bundled into a bomb shelter while they sort of played martial music, which they were listening to in the sort of cellars of Stalingrad, which was just about to be overrun. They're supposed to be listening to this speech, which was going to do wonders for their, as you can imagine, pretty fragile morale. And suddenly all they could hear was the sound of British bombs and classical music. As you can imagine, didn't do much for the fact that they were about to be overrun by the Russians. And, that was when Ted Sizemore sort of first made an impression on senior command. It was also when, just like Embry, he earned a price on his head from the Nazis. His name was well known to the Third Reich, as was Embry's, because he killed his guards escaping from Germany. So they shared that in common. They literally had both of them a price on their heads.
And that raid's the one that leads to Goering saying, they have the geniuses, we have the nincompoops.
Yes, exactly that.
Get me those mosquitoes.
Yeah, and he says, why do we even bother making our new designs? It would be much easier if we just built mosquitoes. And it drove him mad that they were made out of wood rather than metal, because we had access to more aluminium than the Germans, as far as Goering was aware. And yet we didn't bother. We made them in piano factories and furniture factories, sort of all around the country. And the end of that line was Goering saying, well, when this war's over, I'm going to buy myself a British radio, because at least I'll have something that works.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's so the flip side of what everyone thinks of sort of Vorsprung Dutch technique and everything. But listen, Rowland, we've got to get on to Operation Carthage. 21st of March 1945. Since August 1943, the Gestapo has been sort of, this is a real romp through, but I mean, it has basically been sort of closing in on the Danish resistance. Lots of the key people are now in the Shellhus, which is the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, in cells there, and being tortured absolutely horrifically. Monica Witchfeld has been captured and sentenced to death, commuted, but she dies in prison. Age only 50. I mean, just by sort of maltreatment. It's all going pear-shaped, and it is the Danish resistance. It's the new guy who's taken over from Flemming Moos, Ollie Lippmann, who is saying, we need this operation. We need you to come and destroy the Shellhus. And there's massive reluctance, isn't there? Because, it's right in the middle of a city.
I've just read a really interesting review by a kind of former very senior RAF Jaguar pilot who talks about that Operation Carthage raid in terms of moral courage. And that's the thing on both sides of the decision that really struck him. There's Ollie Lippmann having to wrestle with this idea that 26 members of the senior Danish resistance have been put in the attic of the shell house by the Gestapo as a human shield. So that very successfully, 140 Wing Mosquitoes bombed the Gestapo headquarters in Aarhus in Jutland. It was a complete success. They absolutely levelled it. And they didn't lose a single aeroplane, and it was a great success.
Aarhus being another town in Denmark.
That's right. That's a big town in Jutland, which is sort of main Danish peninsula. And immediately, those leading the Gestapo in Copenhagen realised that potentially Shellhouse is in the crosshairs as well. And so they camouflaged the building. I mean, it looks like a sort of dazzle-painted World War I ship. And they build cells in the attic, and they load those cells from the end of the year onwards with senior members of the Danish resistance, including a neurosurgeon called Mogens Fogh, who had been a great partner of Flemming Moos prior to his arrest.
And Bork Anderson, he's there as well.
And Bork Anderson, he's in there. Bork Anderson's story as part of this is really interesting. But so they're in there, and Ole Lippmann has to decide on two things: whether or not he is prepared to sacrifice the lives of his senior colleagues in order to protect the Danish resistance, and whether or not the threat to the Danish resistance from the Gestapo is now so critical that this raid has to happen. All of the Gestapo were pretty methodical. They had this incredible sort of almost sort of Rolodex system where they could cross-reference different members of the resistance, their addresses, and target them so that they could mount sort of mass raids.
But also Denmark is absolutely swarming with Germans by this point, because obviously because of the losses in Northwest Europe, there's more Germans are sort of pushing up into the Jutland Peninsula, isn't there?
I mean, Denmark's like a kind of rest and recuperation, a huge rest and recuperation farm for German soldiers. About 300,000 German soldiers in Denmark. And as we sort of touched on earlier, Denmark had escaped all of the sort of damage and destruction that had afflicted the rest of occupied Europe. And it was up to the resistance to disrupt and degrade the German presence in Denmark. And where German troops from Denmark were going to be sent to reinforce the battle in Normandy, for instance, to delay their arrival. And it was because the Danish resistance delayed the arrival of reinforcements from Denmark that actually there was time for Eisenhower's forces to get to Paris in time to liberate it before reinforcements arrived. He was given a very brief window of opportunity by the senior German officer in Paris. I'm sort of getting distracted again. But yes, Schellhus. So Ole Lippmann had to make this decision. And it had been delegated to him at the time that he parachuted into Denmark specifically by Basil Embry, who believed that trying to hit a single building in such a densely populated city as Copenhagen put at risk as many as 300 innocent civilians. They were literally aiming their bombs using hand-eye coordination. The bomb sights were useless. It was looking at the picture through the cockpit window and coming in low to ensure accuracy.
And as you fly in, you drop the bombs, and the bombs come in at an angle, don't they? Is that right?
If you fly 10 feet over the top of a building, you know that if you dropped your bombs at the right point, they're going to hit the wall that essentially you've just flown over the top of. And it's exactly the technique they used in Amiens, same technique that they used in Aarhus as well, and also and at The Hague as well, where they bombed the Gestapo records there. So the decision was made that such was the threat to the Danish resistance, and such was the threat as a result to the stability in Denmark, which, had it kicked off in Denmark in the way that it had in Warsaw, for instance, or threatened to in Paris when the communists rose up against the Germans at a point when Eisenhower had been hoping he was going to be able to bypass Paris completely. Had that happened, and you suddenly create an unpredictable situation in Northern Europe, populated by 300,000 German troops, it had the potential to sort of derail the planned liberation of Europe in a way that, as I say, was unpredictable and dangerous. So the continued presence of the resistance in Denmark was really critical to maintaining a sort of keeping the plan for the liberation of Europe on track. And so a decision was taken to send in the Mosquitoes, and it was delayed for days because of bad weather. I mean, this was the sort of North European winter. The weather was absolutely foul. And actually, Ole Lippmann had given up any hope of the Mosquitoes arriving and had sort of said as much. He'd signalled London saying, look, we appreciate there must be reasons you can't come. It's sad. I mean, he'd sent a number of increasingly desperate signals wondering where the RAF were. And they couldn't tell him when they were going to come because that would jeopardise the operational security of the mission itself. But on the 21st March 1945, a force of 20 Mosquitoes, armed each with 2,000 pounds of bombs, and 30 escorting Mustangs from Michel Donné's wing at Watersham.
Including Jazz.
Including Jazz Storer. They crossed the North Sea, guided by Ted Sizemore. And it was a remarkable piece of navigation. He's flying at sort of 40 feet over the sea, and all he has is a compass, wind speed, maps, and charts. But this is featureless ocean for an hour and a half. And he's got to try and make landfall in Denmark. And the only way he says he always maintained that flying a mosquito, navigation of a low-level mosquito is more like driving than flying, because you're looking ahead of you rather than down on the landscape. So it's quite hard to get your bearings. And the only way he had of making sure that he was in the right place when they made landfall in Denmark was using Admiralty North Sea pilot charts. So these were used by trawlers to make sure that they were kind of finding the right harbour. So the things marked on there were things like church steeples, buoys, or even tall sand dunes. So he was having to make sure that he was getting the right sand dune as he came into Denmark. But amazingly, he managed to bring that first wave of mosquitoes to Carthage.
With Wing Commander Smith.
With Wing Commander Smith in that first wave, on time, on target with his pilot, Bob, pinpoint Bateson. He'd earned that reputation after...
And also, Rowland, the conditions are really...
Conditions were horrible. They had a fierce headwind the whole way.
I love the fact that Embry called it boisterous.
Boisterous, yeah. And Embry was really enjoying himself, clearly, when you read his memoirs or read interviews with him. Watch interviews with him. While a number of the others in the formation were worried about him. I mean, he was 20 years younger than the rest of them, 20 years older than the rest of them. And they reckoned that his navigator, who'd been a student that he'd sort of hijacked from Cambridge University because he thought he might know how to use a radar, and hadn't actually passed a flight medical, but he was Embry's man. Perhaps didn't have the eyesight that was required for a mission of this sort of precision. So the rest of the team were a bit worried about Embry, but they needn't have worried about him. He was fine. But the new commanding officer of 21 Squadron, Peter Klebo, was not as experienced at flying low level. He was an extremely brave pilot and had won the DFC. He'd fought as part of the rear guard in Burma in a Blenheim Squadron, and he was relatively new to 21 Squadron, who'd lost a couple of commanding officers in quick succession. And on the final approach to the target, he clipped a lighting standard in a marshalling yard, about a mile away from the shell house. His plane was fatally damaged, and he managed to keep it in the air for about another mile, but drifted off course.
There's this amazing bit where he goes between two buildings because he's so low. And the wingspan of a mosquito is something like 52 feet. And there's 3 feet either side of him. I mean, getting through it kind of over 300 miles an hour. I mean, can you imagine it? I mean, it's absolutely astonishing.
If you go to that street now, you can see the new brickwork up at the top of that building on the left, where Klebo's wing, Reg Hall, his navigator, clipped it. Speculation is, and it feels likely, is that they were trying to make their way to a park, which was in an area called Frederiksberg, which was sort of rich, diplomatic kind of area, a suburb of Copenhagen. And they weren't going to make it. They clipped another building. I think he tried to line up on a wide avenue, but he couldn't keep it in the air, and they crashed on some garages there. And because it was garages, and there was tyres, there was fuel, there were sort of cars parked there, it sent up a massive plume of horrible black smoke. And so the first wave of mosquitoes, of 6 mosquitoes, hit the shell house perfectly. But the subsequent waves, and they'd made sure that there was a minute's separation between them so that the second and third wave wouldn't get hit by the explosions from the time-delayed bombs of the waves ahead of them, were distracted by that plume of smoke.
And it's Thompson and Carver, isn't it, who get the wrong target?
That's right. One aeroplane from the second wave, the New Zealand wave, the Australian wave, gets the target wrong, and their bombs hit a school. I mean, the kids, because the air raid sirens have gone off, are already on their way into the bomb shelter at the bottom. But when those bombs hit, walls start to collapse. And I had this sort of remarkable opportunity to meet a man called John Holstein, who had been a pupil at the school on the day and shared his sort of first-hand experiences of that. And he was waiting to make his way to the bomb shelter. And when the third wave came in and further bombs hit nearby the school, walls started to collapse. And he was saved by, it was the loo door. He was standing outside the primary pupil's loo door, and that sort of fell on top of him and then protected him from the rubble that fell. And Klebo was lost, and a couple of the other mosquitoes were also lost. A lot of flak coming up by this point, and the Nuremberg, a German Navy cruiser, was in the harbour, and they unlike a lot of the flak posts which were set up on the rooftops in Denmark, were absolutely on the ball when that raid struck. The Mosquitoes left with the Mustangs, and then there was a desperate race to try and save as many of the children and teachers, nuns from that convent school as possible. And John Holstein was one of those who survived. 87 children were killed, which is absolutely tragic, and very much as Embry had predicted was at risk of happening. I mean, there were too many variables in an operation like this.
Yeah. But most of the resistance guys get out, don't they?
So this is the remarkable flip side of the story, is that not only was from a military point of view, the objective 100% met. They destroyed the Gestapo headquarters. They destroyed all of those Gestapo records. But remarkably, because that first wave bombs went in so low and on the southwest corner of the shell house, without damaging a staircase on the northeast corner, 21 of the prisoners who were being kept in the shell house attic managed to escape. And we talked about Bork Anderson. Bork Anderson was being interrogated at the time that the Mosquito...
Oh, this is amazing, this bit.
He's sitting in front of the desk with his interrogator sitting in front of him with a window behind his interrogator. So Bork Anderson's looking out across Copenhagen, and he sees these Mosquitoes coming in. He wonders whether to shout a warning, and in the end he doesn't. He just stands up, throws the table in the face of his interrogator, and everyone's so surprised, including the guards on the door. They don't know what's going on, and he charges out of the room and charges down the stairs as the bombs are coming into the building, and he manages to escape. And the same is happening on the top floor. They're hearing the bombs hit, and they're kicking down the doors and grabbing the keys off the German guards and letting everybody out. And it's like a sort of scene out of a movie, escaping this collapsing, burning building with sort of explosions in their wakes. They come to the main foyer, and by this time, this came from one of the Australian Mosquitoes, lost his bearings and came in from a different angle on the shell house and took out the main foyer. And so when Mogens Fogg and others make their way to that foyer, they're stepping over horribly badly injured Germans who've been sort of lacerated by the glass from the building. Some have lost legs and limbs, and they're sort of jumping over them to try and escape from the building. And they do. I mean, they look like the people who emerged from 9/11. I mean, they're white with dust when they emerge from the building, sort of running like ghosts through the street to find a safe house.
I've got to say, Ronan, the whole sequence, the raid and how it happens, how it plays out, because what you brilliantly do is you constantly flip from points of view. So one minute you're with, Kleber, the next minute you're with, other pilots, then you're back with the resistance guys, then you're with John in the school. It's absolutely pulsating. I mean, it is absolutely brilliantly conveyed, and it's incredibly exciting. One of the things that kind of I just thought about when I was reading it was, man, what a long way the British have come since 1940. You think about kind of Dunkirk, and then you think just 1945, you've got these just phenomenal aircraft coming in and delivering I mean, that just smacks of just total dominance. That, you have these superior machines and these superior pilots and these superior weapons and superior intelligence. And
you're picking these raids to do,
these raids, and you're hitting a target, which, had it not been for Kleber, would have been 100% successful in every single way. And there wouldn't have been almost certainly no stray bombs on the school or anything. I mean, it's a phenomenal action. I mean, it really, really is.
The audacity and the confidence of that is remarkable. But just to kind of bring this back to the Mosquito, what is really extraordinary, I suppose, is that here we are in March 1945, and we've seen from 1940 the march of technology, the speed with which new designs and more capable airframes have been sort of joining the air forces of both the Allies and the Axis air forces. And yet it isn't until the arrival of the Messerschmitt 262 that the Mosquito is genuinely and comprehensively outclassed as a flying machine. And even then, it was not guaranteed that, as we know from Colin Bell's experience, that a 262 was absolutely going to be able to bring down a mosquito. And at night, the mosquitoes were, if not invulnerable, very, very hard to catch. It speaks volumes of the rightness, the correctness of that initial... I mean, the mould line of the Mosquito, unlike the Spitfire, for instance, didn't change from the moment it entered squadron service until the time it left. I mean, except for sort of different, putting a radar on the front or whatever. In terms of its aerodynamics and its engines, it simply remained the same machine it was in 1941. And to have survived at the top of the tree, almost unchallenged as a flying machine for so long at a time of such swift technological development is really extraordinary.
Well, we're massive fans of the Mosquito on the show, has to be said. Rowland, I'm conscious we've sort of barely sort of scraped the surface of that. It's a fantastic book. It's so entertaining, and I just love it. I'm a big fan of how you write your stuff, and I can't recommend it more highly. So if anyone's in need of a Christmas book, this is one to go and get.
Absolutely. It's a tremendous book, and I think one of the things that needs to be seen to be believed is the photographs of the mosquitoes coming in over Copenhagen, how low they are. You can see how you might clip a lamppost or scrape a wall. You can completely see it. It's absolute guts of the men doing it.
I just love that. There's that one, just to finish on Embry, that lovely scene where he's dropped his bombs and suddenly there's a sort of shadow overhead his aeroplane, like a sort of bird of prey. And he's already at rooftop level and he's flying down the middle of a street and he can see people scattering into doorways to try and avoid his Mosquito. I mean, as you say, Al, it's hard to get that picture out of your head for sure.
Well, thanks very much, Rowland. Mosquito is in all good bookshops. There we go. Well, no one's watching this, there's no point me holding it up to the camera.
They might be.
Force of habit. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.